Uh, Hi everyone. I'm Jamil Zaki. I'm the principal investigator of the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab. I'll get that right next time. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about publishing and writing, and we're just going to give folks a few minutes to arrive, and then Andrea Courtney, a postdoc in the lab, and myself will be chatting with you all today. So again, we'll give everyone just probably 3 minutes or so, and then we'll jump in. Okay. See you soon. Hi, everybody. Jamil Zaki here. So we're going to be getting started with our session on writing and publishing in just a couple of minutes. We're just giving folks time to arrive, and yeah, we'll jump in probably at about 11:03. Looking forward to it. Hi, everyone. Jamil here. We're going to get started in just probably 1 minute or so. We're just giving folks time to arrive. Looking forward to it. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Jamil Zaki. I'm the PI of the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab, and want to welcome you to our professional development workshop. We're back again, and today we're going to be talking about some topics that are near and dear to my heart, writing and publishing. And so I'll be chatting with you today, and then we're also thrilled to have with us a postdoc from our lab, Andrea Courtney. Oh, I think you're muted, Andrea.
Of course. Thanks. I'm Andrea Courtney. I'm a postdoc in the Stanford Social Neuroscience Lab, and I'll be picking up the second half of the talk to talk about academic publishing.
Great. Thanks for doing this, Andrea. Thanks for being here. Yeah, so I'll start out today. So just to give you a sense of what the session will look like, I'll be talking about writing in general, our feelings about writing, some principles around writing, and I'll just talk really pretty briefly for maybe 15 minutes. And then really what I'm looking forward to is your questions and thoughts, sort of what the writing process means to you, and how we can reflect together on getting more comfortable with writing, better at it, sort of figuring out how to write in the most effective way about psychology and neuroscience. So after I'll speak for about 15 minutes, we'll take about 15 or so minutes of questions. And then Andrea, you're going to take it away after that, right?
Yep, that sounds great.
Okay, and Andrea will be talking about publishing, and likewise, she'll speak, and then we'll have questions afterwards. So please feel free to chime in really at any time, but especially sort of in between our presentations. So with that, I guess I will share my screen. Here we go. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that, and I'm sure that that one of my friends will tell me if they can't. So I'm assuming that this is working. So yeah, I happen to really love writing. It turns out that before I was ever in neuroscience. I wanted to be a writer. In fact, I minored in creative writing in college and thought that that's what I would do as a career afterwards. Turns out I was not very good at it, so that was a lesson learned. But I still love writing, and I do it a lot, and I love talking about writing as well. So again, I'm going to share some of my thoughts, but I'm really here for yours. So please, please feel free to use the chat function to tell me your thoughts on writing or your questions about it. I want to start by saying some of you maybe have seen me give a talk before, some of you have not. Many of you probably have not, but I've been using this cover slide, this title slide for like the last 14 years for every single talk I've given anywhere. And it turns out that this, this weird drawing is actually from somewhere. It's from the margins of my very first academic paper when I was a second year grad student. I was writing this paper, and one of my advisors, Niall Bolger, this was old fashioned even at the time, liked to print out papers and I guess draw on them was one of the things that he did, and he made this little doodle. He also really liked to comment on them, and here's just one little bit of the comments that he made on my first manuscript that I sent him. And you can see that a lot was wrong with this manuscript. So I didn't define the very first term that I used, which was empathy, at all. There was grammatical errors that he gleefully called out. And then he told me that one part of my writing sounded a bit vacuous, which, I mean, come on, Niall. That's just cold. You don't really need to tell someone that, or maybe use that language. Anyways, I got this sort of marked up manuscript, and I decided that I should probably quit academia because I was no good at writing, and I immediately hated the process. Thankfully, Niall is a really supportive and cool guy and walked me through it, and I ended up feeling better about it afterwards. But I guess my point here is, it's okay to struggle with writing. It's okay to be embarrassed by your old writing. In fact, it's embarrassing for me to show you this text right now because I see it as so poorly written. I actually think it's better to be embarrassed by your old writing than to not be embarrassed by it. Because if you're not embarrassed by it, maybe you're not changing and growing. Right? So anyways, I know that academic writing isn't all that people feel different ways about it. I'd love to hear how you feel about it. So I'm going to do this in the form of a couple of different polls on academic writing. Dean, are you? These are just me true or false questions. Dean, are you able to share the first poll here? Great. So this is a true false question. Writing is part of the research process that I look forward to. You can feel free to answer that. No right or wrong answer, of course. And Dean, whenever we have sufficient responses, please feel free to share those. Okay, look at this. 80% of us feel that writing is a part of the research process that we look forward to. That's terrific. Okay, let's go to the next poll. Okay, true or false? Writing is a part of the research process that I dread. And mind you, both of these can be true for you and both of these can be false. All right, and Dean, when we have sufficient responses, again, please feel free to share. All right, 50-50. That's really interesting. So again, here we've got 80% of us sort of looking forward to writing and 50% of us dreading it, right? Again, suggesting that we maybe are ambivalent. We have multiple feelings around writing. I'd love you to share some using the chat. Let me know sort of why you look forward to writing, what you might dread about it. What are your feelings around writing? How would you describe your feelings around academic writing and sort of trying to get your ideas out to an audience through writing? And take your time to think about it. Yeah, looking forward to, and again, you can use the chat here. And again, please feel free to share either things that you look forward to about writing or things that you dread about it. I know that we feel multiple ways about writing. Okay, here we've got a terrific comment. I like writing and enjoy sharing my ideas, but academic writing and sharing research results is something that intimidates me. Great, so here we've got a division between two different types of writing, in general and academic. We've got another person here. For me personally, it's very hard to structure the flow of writing. What sentence should go after what? Gosh, I hear that so much. I feel that way as well. Another person, Rose, tells us that I've always loved writing, but I do worry that academic writing feels mechanical and formulaic. Very important observation. Academic writing detracts from the magic and creativity of the general writing process. So here we're finding that writing and academic writing feel different. Academic writing a little bit intimidating, and maybe also sapping some of the things that make us enjoy writing in the first place. And then finally, a positive comment here. It's a place to see my ideas come together, my work come together as a coherent study. Absolutely, I think that's a great sort of positive reflection here. Let me just say, what you're saying, what all of you are saying is exactly what lots of people feel, what I've heard countless people say, that academic writing is just not something that people look forward to, even if they like writing in general. Here's one tweet from a few years ago that I think sums it up well. Successful academic writing, approximately 1% inspiration. Obviously, this does not add up to 100 here, but 90% non-negotiable deadlines, right? In other words, we write, especially in academia, sometimes only when we have to. So I think it's totally normal to be uncomfortable with writing, and academic writing in particular. And for me, one of the things that I think is so crucial in moving from a place of discomfort to one of comfort is becoming comfortable with discomfort. You're saying, what does that mean? It means understanding that writing will not necessarily feel good all the time, and that you won't necessarily like what you're writing, especially at first. I don't think there's a better expression of this than Anne Lamott in her terrific, just incredible essay. I'm happy to share it with the group. Shitty first drafts, pardon my language. She says, and I'll just read the first couple of sentences here, that almost all good writing begins with terrible first efforts. You need to start somewhere. Start by getting something, anything, down on paper. And that's something that has sort of meant a lot to me, and is really sort of where I begin with almost all writing, right? I think that a way of putting this is that in order to be comfortable with something, you need to practice it. So practice might not make perfect, but it at least sort of normalizes this experience for you, normalizes the experience of writing, and makes you realize that even something that doesn't feel comfortable at the beginning can become really productive and fun later on. I guess my comparison here always is running. It turns out that I enjoy running to the extent that someone can. And I often think that writing is a little bit like running. People say, how do you get good at writing? And I kind of feel like that's like asking, how do you get good at running? Now, there is technique in running, but it's pretty minimal. And really, the only way to get good at it, to run longer distances, to run faster, is to do it a lot, right? And so with that in mind, I think my first piece of advice for everybody in academic or other types of writing is just to create a habit and stick to it, right? To really find whatever works for you, a regular writing practice. And I want to highlight that there are two ways that people tend to do this, and I'm going to show my bias and say I think one of them is way better than the other. Some people pick a day of the week and they say, this is my writing day. Other people pick some hours in each day and say, these are my hours. I want you to consider, at least if it's possible, regular writing hours instead of regular writing days. Now, why is that? Let me go back to the running analogy. Let's say that you had a goal, like I want to run 10 miles a week or 15 miles a week if you're super ambitious, right? What do you think would work better if you want to get to that goal? Well, one idea is you could try to run 15 miles once a week. But that might not feel very good. You might not succeed, and you might feel later like you're failing and like it's just not worth trying. Another option would be to say, I'm going to try to run 2 miles a day. That to me would be way more effective. when people have these like one writing day a week, I feel like they're putting a lot of pressure on themselves to produce an enormous, maybe unrealistic amount in that one day. And there's a lot of negative thoughts that can go into that, right? If we're not producing the first couple of hours of that day, did I blow my chance for the week? Am I not going to be able to make it? Whereas regular writing hours, I think, are much more sustainable and potentially comfortable. I'd also encourage you to focus on process and not just a product. Sometimes we think that we need to wait until we've collected all of our data and run all of our analyses and done an entire 5-month-long literature review before we're willing to put one word down on paper. I know that when I write, even now, like almost 20 years into an academic career, my first thought is, who am I to say anything? I haven't read enough. I haven't done enough to really understand in a crystal clear manner what I want to say right now. But I think that the process of writing is just as important, if not more important than the product. So what I'd encourage you to do is, even if you are only collecting data right now, or even if you've just started a literature review, still spend like at least an hour a day writing about it, writing about your thoughts right now, writing about your hypotheses and why you have them, writing about how the 3 papers that you just read are connected to one another, right? Writing just as a process is so valuable. And I think that if you can do it regularly, you've sort of won the game already. A second thing that I want to talk about when it comes to writing is that it's an opportunity. And it's an opportunity that I think we often don't take to engage in empathy and perspective taking. Now, some of you said that you really like writing in general, but not academic writing, and that sometimes academic writing is restrictive, formulaic, and I agree. I think that academic writing, if I can use an even more pejorative term, I think is exclusive. I think that oftentimes we feel as though academic writing has to look a certain way, which is very uninviting to people who are not us or not part of our field. As though the way that we signal our own expertise is by writing things that are indecipherable to anybody who's not an expert, which is not necessary. I think sometimes we feel like it's necessary, but I don't think it is. And I don't think that it's a good practice. Again, I mean, I think that some of you said, what did someone say? Oh yeah, that academic writing detracts from the magic and creativity of the general writing process. I think it does when we do it the way that we sometimes have learned to, which is using a whole ton of jargon and writing only for, the 100 or 500 people who understand exactly what we're talking about, our editors and reviewers. But writing is a chance to teach and also to broaden our own thinking. And, I think to take other people's perspective. And so the first step, I think, in addition to having a writing practice, that I encourage people to try when they start a manuscript or a proposal or whatever, is to vividly imagine their audience. Really think about what they know and what they care about. And depending on how you write, your audience can change. So if you're writing for instance, a journal that's very specific to one corner of your field, it might be totally okay to use pretty local writing that really just speaks to that community. But a lot of us want to write or feel as though our research could impact lots of people, even folks who are from other scientific fields or who aren't scientists at all. And if you feel that that's true, I think it's important to embrace the challenge of really taking those people's perspective and writing for everybody. And my own sense is that rigorous academic writing can coexist with very open writing that appeals to lots of people. One thing that I encourage people in a writing class that I've taught before to do is what I call the Thanksgiving exercise, right? So imagine that you are, home for the holiday. Well, we're all home now, aren't we? But imagine that you're home for the holidays and you're talking with, I don't know, an aunt of yours who maybe studied art history in college, for instance. And she says, well, what are you working on? I really think that writing oftentimes should look a lot more like what we would say to an aunt like that than it does in practice, right? Because your aunt and most people in your audience probably care about people, experiences, and stories. Thankfully, at least for us in psychology and neuroscience, we often are studying people and their experiences. So we have an advantage. We're writing about stuff that people, or thinking about stuff that people already care about. But oftentimes we don't write in those terms. We instead write about things that maybe they don't care that much about, like the literature. We start a lot of our papers with researchers have found this and this and this, as opposed to talking about the actual phenomenon, the phenomenon in human terms. We also write a lot about inside baseball, just the way that what we're doing adds to what other people have done in the past. That's a crucial point to make, but it might not be the best starting point. So again, I encourage you to practice perspective taking. This is especially important, again, because oftentimes the biggest failure that we have when we write is believing that other people already know and care about what we know and care about, which is known as the curse of knowledge. I don't know if any of you have heard that term before, but basically, now many of you are pretty early in your research career, but later you're going to continue to become more and more expert in more and more specific parts of the scientific world. You're going to know so much about a very, specific set of questions and ideas. And that will give you a curse of knowledge, because basically you will have a magnifying glass of enormous power up to one leaf. And you'll want to write about that leaf and talk about that leaf, but other people won't know very much about it. They'll just know about the forest that it belongs to. And so I think it's one really crucial thing in starting the writing process and in thinking about how we want to do academic writing that doesn't lose the magic of writing in general, is thinking about whether we can start with that forest for everybody, and then get to the specific things that we know and that we're adding to it. I'm going to now horribly mix metaphors, which I should probably not do in a session on writing, but here we go. I think that, this view pertains to how we might want to structure our manuscripts and what is appropriate for different parts of a manuscript. So I think of it as a flight. I know, a forest, now a plane. So I think of it as a good idea to start at 30,000 feet, sort of at the apex, and really just talk about the phenomenon that we're interested in, right? So for me, it's empathy. So rather than saying psychologists have studied this and this about empathy, just grounding people in the intuitions that they have about it, grounding people in their experience about what it's like to connect with other people, how that's helpful, and so forth. Then I think in an introduction section, it's important to say what we know and don't know, and especially what wasn't known before the research that you did. Then I see the methods and results section as sort of descending, getting closer to the ground, providing more detail, and in particular, really focusing on operationalizations, right? So moving from the phenomenon that everyone understands to the technique that you use to illuminate that phenomenon, the way that you turned that big idea into independent variables, dependent variables, and tests. And then I think we can also focus on narrative. I think a lot of times people don't take advantage of the fact that a study or an experiment is a story in and of itself. And I think focusing on telling that story, really sort of showing what you did in a linear fashion, in a clear fashion, can be a lot easier, more pleasant, and better to the reader than sort of losing yourself in jargon. And then I see, as you enter the discussion section of a paper, sort of ascending again back to 30,000 feet and returning to the phenomenon and what you know now that you didn't know before the study began. So I'm just going to end with a couple of really brief notes on process here. Actually, I'm going to end with two things. One, on mechanics, rather. So we can talk a lot more in detail about this, but I think it's really important to avoid certain things that are all over academic writing, but just don't have to be there. So things like the passive voice, like abstractions, sort of really not concrete forms of writing, and jargon. Also, I want to add overstuffed clauses. I think a lot of sentences in academia are just so torturous, and they really don't have to be, because people are trying to pack in so much information into really, again, jargony, abstract, and passive voiced sentences. By contrast, I'd encourage you to embrace the type of writing that you see outside academia, outside of science. Things like active voice, concrete language, and clear definitions, as well as linearity and short sentences. I've been talking for long enough now. I want to turn to your questions, but first I wanted to share one more thought, which is that at least in my experience, writing is not just communication. I think of it as a process of rediscovery. So to go back to that forest for the leaves metaphor, we end up often in our scientific careers really hyper focused on relatively small questions, and we love those questions and we devote tons of time to figuring them out, and we should. But sometimes talking with our aunts or other people outside of our field and really focusing on how we can communicate what we care about in ways that they would understand and resonate with also brings us back to the beginning, to the excitement that we had, the curiosity that we had at the beginning of the research process. And rediscovering that interest can be a really powerful and enjoyable thing in and of itself. So I'll stop there, but would love to hear your thoughts and questions. Andrea, also, if you have any thoughts, I'm happy to hear them as well. You've been doing this type of writing for quite a long time.
Sure. I have maybe just a couple thoughts on a couple things you just said about the mechanics and things to avoid. And I think this also touches on some of the comments that we got about worrying about grammar or worrying that, writing in a second language, for example. I guess my question for you, I have kind of a process that I think works for me. I also have a question for you, which is, at what stage in the writing process do you think it's best to be concerned about those things? So I know for me, and I think this relates back to kind of the shitty first drafts, but I think a lot of us have like gotten a bit used to using the passive voice or using jargon, for example, if we are really focused in our area of science. So for myself, I think it's best to just kind of write the jargony version, just write whatever version comes out, and then maybe focus on writing for clarity in like the editing stage. Would you agree with that, or do you have more suggestions?
I would agree with that. Yeah, I think that, first of all, not all jargon is bad, right? I mean, jargon serves a purpose. The purpose that it serves is basically abbreviating, right? Like if there's a really complex idea that people in our field know about through a 1 or 2 or 3 word phrase, by all means, use that phrase instead of repeating the complicated idea over and over again. Couple of thoughts. One is it's just super important to have a really concise and clear definition of jargon that we're going to use ahead of time, sort of right at the beginning of a paper. 2, I think it's great to limit our, one of the things that is so alienating to me is reading papers that have like 14 different 3-letter abbreviations that are then sort of like, I feel like I'm reading a partially redacted CIA document or something. Like, what? Oh, what does this all mean? So I think that sort of being spare with jargon and then using it, I guess, intentionally, right? And then also bringing the reader in so that you are sure that they understand it, even if they didn't at the beginning of the paper, is useful. Now to your actual question, Andrea. Yeah, I think that a shitty first draft should be just shitty in whatever way it has to be, right? Whatever allows us to feel like we can get words down on paper, I think matters. I will say that sometimes, I like to spend different sort of writing sessions focused on different things. Some of them are just getting ideas down. Other writing sessions, I try to spend really focused on mechanics, on the type of writing that I want to be doing, that I enjoy. And one thing that I would suggest for people who want to do that is to focus on what is inspiring to you. Finding a piece of writing in academia or outside it that really speaks to you, that you really love, and trying to model that style of writing as you do it yourself. Great. I see a question here. You've published both books and journal articles. Can you share your experience on how the writing process for each looked different? Oh yeah, absolutely. So I write a lot for popular. I don't know if my writing is actually popular, but it's designated that way because it's non-academic. So I find that non-academic and academic writing is more similar for me than I think people might imagine, right? So you might think that if I'm doing non-academic writing or trying to write a book, I might like put a beret on and have an espresso and sort of just tap into my artistic self. No, I mean, it's really, I really try to, I think that writing non-academic stuff has actually influenced my academic writing enormously, because I think that there's a lot of things that we force ourselves into, a lot of patterns that we force ourselves into because we think they're the right way to produce academic writing. We think that's the appropriate way to write a paper, for instance. And of course, we don't want to write every paper with we want to start a journal article with once upon a time necessarily. But I think that non-academic writing has shown me that, in fact, I can write about people and I can write about stories even in an academic context. The process is different. I'll say that one thing that I do a lot in both academic and non-academic writing is outlining. I think it's really important to have an idea of where you want to go before you start. To give you a sense of what an outline looks like for me, I like to think about basically I like to write one sentence for every paragraph that a manuscript will have. And I'd like that sentence to look like the headline of each paragraph. So if you think that each paragraph has a thesis to it, and I do think that each paragraph should have a thesis to it, then I think a great outline is basically just asserting what the thesis would be. And that allows you to, again, sort of take a 30,000-foot view on what the manuscript is like and organize it. Oftentimes when I look at my trainees' manuscripts, not yours, Andrea, of course, but everybody who's not you, I think I try to actually do that retroactively. And I try to myself write the thesis sentence of each paragraph. And you know what I find sometimes? Not every paragraph has a clear thesis sentence, which to me is an indication that maybe there's too much writing, and not every paragraph is necessary, or that the writer wasn't clear on the beats that they wanted to cover ahead of time. I'm seeing that we have some more questions. Andrea, do you want to voice some of these questions? That could be fun.
Yes, one second. Okay, so what is the line between following academic writing convention and adding your own flair? How do we appropriately push the envelope with writing to make it seem like we're pushing for positive change in academic writing, rather than simply being labeled as an amateur?
Yeah, what a good question. In fact, something that I ran into myself. I remember writing a paper early in my career and having someone who was senior to me basically say, I think you're trying to write a novel. This is not appropriate academic writing. And then the paper was published and I got all sorts of emails from people who said, wow, what a refreshing read, right? So I think that the question really boils down to a couple of things. One, our own level of comfort, sort of pushing the envelope, pushing for positive change is a good thing to do. It's also important to feel as though we're safe in whatever type of writing we want to do. So I don't want to encourage people to do anything that they're not comfortable with. The second thing I think is that I don't know that there's a line here between academic writing convention and adding our own flair. It's more a spectrum, right? I mean, I think that there's really down the fairway, down the middle academic writing, and then there's really adventurous academic writing, and we can explore every space in between. One writer who really inspires me is Dan Gilbert, who's a psychologist at Harvard. And I remember reading a chapter of his called Ordinary Personology. And even the title, I was like, Ordinary Personology, what does that mean? And it's just, he writes about social cognition, attribution, these other terms. And he says, why do we call this stuff, why do we use these jargony terms? Really, all we're talking about in social cognition is the way that ordinary people try to understand people, which I'm going to call personology because it's their study of people. I thought it was just, and Gilbert's at Harvard, he's like an old white guy at Harvard. So he's in this absolutely safest position that anyone can be in. But nonetheless, I was so appreciative as a junior trainee of him as an example of a type of writing that didn't necessarily toe the line.
Great. So I think this next question relates a bit to that. So do you think there's a sort of a shift in the field toward embracing a more inclusive form of academic writing? So there used to be more of a conventional sort of style that was very jargon packed. And do you think the field as a whole is kind of shifting?
No, no, I don't think so. I wish. I mean, I'm certainly pushing for it. And I think that there's, I want us to be there. But if I'm honest, I mean, I think that the same patterns that were there when I started are still very much present in academic writing. And I think that there's still a lot of people who think that there's only one way to do it. And yeah, I think that it doesn't have to be that way. I hope that, I like the use of inclusivity here, because I think this is one advantage of really broadening the scope of who does science. We all have different ways of doing science, but we also have different ways of talking and writing about science. And, my hope of a truly inclusive field would be one in which people not only are able to be part of the field, but able to engage with it in ways that are true to them. So I want that to be part of the field. And then I see, do you think is it possible that reviewers might discriminate against authors who use less conventional forms of super jargon-packed academic writing? Yeah, I think that, again, this is a spectrum. So for me, early in my career, I was sort of pushing just a little bit. And then now I kind of don't care whether people reject something, a particular paper. I mean, obviously, if my trainees are on it, I want it to be, but if I'm just like, I write a lot of academic essays, for instance, and reviews. And there I just feel complete comfort to write however I want. So I think it takes time to establish oneself. And, again, I think that it's a spectrum and we can push little by little to sort of change the way that we write or express ourselves in different ways. And it's something to be experimented with, not just something that you have to roll out right away.
Great. There's another question about how many times do you need to edit your writing, and how do you know if it's good enough?
Oh gosh. Well, good enough is a vanishing horizon. There's no such thing as good enough. In fact, if you want to really truly identify all the grammatical errors in your paper, all you have to do is submit it to a journal, and they will immediately. Have you ever had that experience, Andrea?
I have not, but I definitely had plenty of other people identify grammatical errors that I've read.
I think every time I think something is ready and I write, paper X, final, 9 finals on it, it's still packed with errors. And there's no published paper that I have where I read it and don't think, gosh, I could have done that better. So I don't think there's an end point. It's more about satisficing, which is a term for basically discovering what is good enough for a particular purpose, not what's good overall. How many times do we have to edit our writing? My first manuscript, the one that you saw riddled with Niall's edits, if we will, comments, went through 27 drafts before we ever submitted it to a journal. And I just found that so excruciating. I couldn't believe it. I thought that at draft 3 we were done. And my primary advisor, Kevin Oxner, just pushed and pushed and pushed. And I was so frustrated with him at the time, and I'm so grateful to him now. And, people in my lab know that I really push people a lot on writing as well. And, I tend to be really direct and say what I don't think is working. And I think it can be frustrating when you think that you're done or close to done. But I think that my job as a mentor, and I also think my job as a writer in interrogating my own writing, is to push. Not to say push for perfection, but to push for a sense that it's authentic, that it's as good as it can be, and that it does the job of communication. That it gets. I remember I took a writing workshop once, and our teacher said, you want to think of the reader as getting in a car with you, and you want to make sure you don't throw it. But the car has no doors. Sorry, I forgot this crucial detail. The car has no doors and no windows. So it's really just a frame of a car. And you're driving, and let's say we're in California, Andrea, let's say you're driving down the 1. For those of you who have not been on the 1, it's a really curvy road that's right over a cliff, right? And they're sitting in the passenger seat. And your job is to not throw them off the cliff, right? So you need to watch out and know where they are at all times. And if you hit a turn, you need to slow down and make sure that they're with you, right? And so I think that's, when I push writing, when I revise writing, I really ask myself over and over again, really harshly, is the reader still with me? And if they're not, then I make big changes. And if I'm reading my trainees' writing and I think that the reader's been tossed out the window, I tell my, I mean, I don't think I've ever used that language, Andrea, with your writing at least, but you know, I really try to push people.
I love that imagery. I feel like the idea of like a reader-centric writing is a really good thought. And I feel like sometimes that gets lost when you're writing in the process. You kind of forget about the reader, but I think it's really important to keep the reader front and center. I have like a suggestion that I've heard you make for catching kind of those low-level grammatical errors, which is to read it once you have a final-ish draft, to read it out loud. Which is almost a certain way to catch all kinds of spelling and grammatical errors. And I think Word even has like an option it'll read it out loud to you in that like awkward automated voice, but that's also a good way to catch some of those grammatical errors.
Yes, thanks for saying that, Andrea. That's a concrete piece of advice that I think is so important, that I learned from my postdoc advisor. And I learned it quickly because he told me once, he said, "This doesn't seem like you read it out loud. Next, I want you to read all of your manuscripts out loud before you send them to me." And then I sent him another manuscript, and he wrote back and he said, "I'm not going to read this because I can tell you didn't read it out loud." So yeah, I think it's actually the fact that it's detectable whether you've done it or not is a clear sign that's a good tip. I want to transition now, Andrea, to having you present. First, I do want to just double down on the imagery of reader-centric writing. I think there's you know, in retail, the customer is always right. And in writing, the reader is always right. I think if there's something that a reader can't grasp, I always think of it as my fault as a writer, not theirs as a reader, right? And I think that respecting a reader involves having them in mind. And so, yeah, I think that as you know, Andrea, oftentimes I'll tell my trainees, the reader here doesn't know what you said. They don't care about this. They don't know what you mean, and they're lost, right? And so I think that keeping them in mind is, yeah, that's actually probably the broadest piece of advice I can offer. So I see that we have other questions. I'm going to try to answer this other one offline, Andrea, because I really want to make sure that you have plenty of time. So I'll stop my share now. Thanks everyone for your terrific questions. And I'm here, and after Andrea speaks, we'll also have more time to chat.
Okay, great. I might just add one more kind of ancillary point to that, which is that if you are someone that struggles with writing or the motivation to write, I think this idea of a habit is really great, but something that some of us need both with running and writing is a sense of accountability. And I've seen a lot of academics form sort of writing groups where you can just kind of report your writing on a daily basis if you want. You can set daily goals. Or you can even, I have a friend that I meet sort of once a week with, and we write at the same time. But you can do it on a daily basis as well, just to have some sort of accountability structure. Obviously not everyone needs that, but some of us do.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Can everyone, or can someone signal to me, I guess, if they don't see my screen? Okay, cool. So what I'm gonna do here is just, sorry, let me just make sure this is out of the way. Oh, sorry. Okay, so I'm just gonna follow up on that to talk a bit more about sort of the nuts and bolts of academic publishing. I'll give you sort of an overview of the process and talk through some kind of rules of thumb and provide hopefully some resources for you. All right, so this is just a sort of flow chart of the publication process as a whole, starting with your manuscript submission. So after you submit your manuscript to a journal, it's going to go through an initial screening phase. So there's a part of this that's going to be automated, that's going to detect things like formatting and whether you've included all the parts of the manuscript that you're supposed to include. Then it's also going to go to a handling editor, which is basically going to be the step in the process where they determine whether they send it out to review or whether they desk reject it. And essentially, if your manuscript at that point fails to meet journal requirements, it might be rejected at that point, which can happen in the first actually hours or up to a couple of weeks. But if it does go to peer review, they'll send it out to a few different reviewers, which I will talk a bit more about in just a little bit. And from that, the handling editor will make an editorial decision. which is considering all of the reviewer feedback, and then they'll send that decision to you in a decision letter. So that goes to the authors. And there are sort of three branches here that you can see after the peer review and editorial decision phase, where if at that point it's determined that your manuscript is not fit for the journal, it might be rejected, at which point you'll take all of the feedback that you've gotten, improve your manuscript, and submit somewhere else. Alternatively, it might be accepted without revision, in which case it'll fast track to being accepted, which I think is pretty rare. That would be awesome and would save you a lot of time. But more common than that is that you'll get a bunch of revisions and recommendations back from your reviewers about how to update and change your manuscript to make it more fitting for the journal and higher quality. At which stage your manuscript basically goes back into your own hands, so it gets sent back to the authors for additional revisions. At that point, it's considered under revision. You'll probably have 4 to 6 weeks to make your revisions to the manuscript, which might require additional analyses or just changes to the writing or some sort of, in some cases, I think also additional data collection, so that can vary quite a bit. But once you make those revisions, you will resubmit your revised manuscript. And that might also go back to peer review, sort of re-review. That could also, reviewers could then request additional revisions. So this process could be iterative. And essentially, at any of those points, you can make revisions and then the manuscript can be rejected. Hopefully, you're being very responsive to reviewers, you make revisions, and eventually your manuscript is accepted. And at that point, it's considered in press. It goes through the production process, which is where a lot of the formatting and copy editing happens. You may get author queries or requests for additional edits to the manuscript or to the figures to make sure that the figures are high enough quality, for example. And then you'll get final page proofs, which is where the authors really look over, make sure everything looks good and is formatted correctly. And is accurate, and then it will be published at some point, either online or in print, or maybe both. So one thing I want to highlight is that this is a pretty long process. So it's, I think, averages in between 6 months and a year. The average time from submission to acceptance is around 100 days. Acceptance to publication is around 30 days, but this varies a lot by journal. So I'm going to walk through some of these steps in a bit more detail, but I just want to highlight a few important steps and considerations before submission. So before any of that, you're going to be spending quite a lot of time preparing your manuscript, which is sort of the invisible part of the publication process. So I'm just going to point out a couple of resources that might be useful for you there. So one of these, so whenever you're thinking about the implications and writing up your research for your audience, you're going to need to know about the relevant literature, or what we already know about the state of the world, in a sense. And you can do this by accessing, or you can access the relevant literature through a few different sources, but they're primarily going to be these journal databases and search engines. You can check your library catalog for journals that have paid subscriptions that your university might be subscribed to. Also check sources like Google Scholar. Google Scholar is what I typically default to. You can check JSTOR, PubMed. These are all search engines for journal articles. You'll want to, if you have a university email, you can use your university connection or VPN to access articles, again, that aren't open access that your university might have a subscription to. And I just want to point out that many scientists will publish their post-print articles on their websites, and these will actually be accessed through Google Scholar if you use that. And then I'm just going to briefly intro another source, which is separate from all of that. It was sort of, there's, I think, a Kazakhstani hacker that created this project called Sci-Hub that is basically a large server that hosts a bunch of journal articles for free. They're free access to everyone, and it basically bypasses paywalls and copyright in order to provide free access. That's there. If there's something that you don't have a subscription for and you need to access it, you can look into Sci-Hub. Okay, and then another thing that's going to be really useful for you is to find a good reference management system. So there are a whole host of them. I've listed a bunch of them here. They're all pretty similar. But this is essentially going to allow you to save a collection of article PDFs with notes and annotations, and allow you to easily cite them with plugins to Word, OpenOffice, or Google Docs, so that you can cite within your article and then compile a references section. So you're not going to want to do this manually. It's much easier to do something like this. Most of these have a free option, and many of them have a browser version and also a desktop version. So another thing, whenever we're thinking about writing and editing, you might want to check in with your university writing center. So there might be tutors or editors that'll be really good resources for getting motivation or getting unstuck if you're stuck. A lot of times they'll help walk you through outlining what you need to write. It's also just nice for the accountability and having another set of eyes. They may also have resources for editing, particularly for non-native English speakers. So English is the lingua franca for science, so most scientific articles are published in English. So you might want to look into some of these resources. Some of this will be some of the grammatical errors will be caught in copy editing by the journal. You really don't want that you don't want to wait until that process, because you don't want it to affect your review. So there are other online resources that I have listed here. ReciteWorks for checking references, Grammarly for checking grammar, Pro Writing Aid that checks grammar and style. And then there's a collection here by Jacqueline Siegel of a whole host of free and low-cost resources that I have linked here. And we'll be sharing the slides later, so you can grab those links. Okay, let me just pause for a second and see if we have any questions. It looks like there's some.
Yes, sorry, now I'm chewing. So we have one question. I've been told it's expensive to publish articles in journals. Are there hefty fees associated with this process?
Cool. Okay. Yes. I'll touch on that in just a few minutes. There can most certainly be hefty fees, and they will vary from journal to journal. And they'll come in a couple of different forms. So I'll touch on that in just a minute. Was that the only question for now?
I believe so. Hold on one second.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. So the other thing you're going to want to consider before you ever get to the submission process is authorship. So you're really going to want to discuss and come to an agreement on authorship, who is included as an author or co-author on the paper well before submission, and really very early on in the project. But most journals do have an expectation of what it means to be an author, and there are requirements for that. And they vary a little bit, but they pretty much, most of them boil down to expecting that each author has contributed substantially to the conception or design of the work, or the acquisition, analysis, or interpretation of the data, or drafting or revising for intellectual contribution. And then in addition, that all authors have approved the final draft and have accepted responsibility for the integrity of the work. So that's really what it means to be an author, and kind of the bar for authorship. But you may also be asked to designate more specific author contributions during the submission. So you may actually say, name particular authors who were specifically involved in data analysis, or specifically involved in design, or involved in writing. Okay, and so the last kind of pre-submission decision that I'll touch on here is the choice of journal. So really, again here, I guess you could think of this being very reader-centric too. You want to think about your target audience, and this is going to drive a lot of these decisions. The first being what kind of journal you're going to submit to, whether you're going to submit to a general journal or a more specialized journal, for example. So general journals tend to be more multidisciplinary and broad scope. They might be higher in impact or have, a broader audience base. But then again, specialized journals, if well tailored to your discipline and the sort of impact of the research that you're publishing, may be the best choice for reaching a more interested target audience. And then another piece that I actually found really helpful is trying to think about the content of the journal that the journal is typically publishing, and whether that's a good match for your article. So you can do this semantic search using, there's a tool called JANE, or Journal Author Name Estimation. and I'll just show you a quick example. But what you do is you can just add in your abstract or a title into this search box and click find journals, and it will output a whole list of journals based on the confidence of the fit, whether they would be a good outlet for your or an appropriate outlet for your paper. And it also has article influence and some tags like whether they're open access, for example. I found this really useful. You don't necessarily, it's just been useful for kind of brainstorming journals that might be a good fit because they have published similar work in the past. But then there are a couple of other considerations that you might have, one of them being sort of impact and prestige metrics. You'll hear a lot about these. Journals have these kind of summary metrics, and they're basically, so an impact factor, for example, is an indicator of how often articles in that journal are typically cited, and it's based off of the previous 2 years. There's also this Simago journal rank, which somehow averages the influence, or it averages impact and prestige to rank based off of influence. And another consideration you may have is whether or not you want to publish in an open access journal. So if you're publishing open access, that means that it's more available and accessible to a broader audience. So it's not behind a paywall. So most traditional journals are only available and you can only access if you or your university have purchased a typically print subscription. So these open access journals, you don't have to access with VPN. You don't have to be a scientist or have a subscription to access. But also being open access is not a binary. So there are actually different kind of shades of open access. And Sherpa Romeo is a nice database of journals and their, and their open access policies. You can check that out. I will mention, so this is, where I wanted to mention that most journals do have a publication charge, and these can be quite steep. But that usually happens after your article has been accepted, and the charge goes into the public to pay for the publication process. There are some journals that also have a submission fee, which basically you pay as soon as you submit your article and you don't get it back, even if your paper gets rejected. And then others will have, if it's not, will have an open access charge. So for example, there may be traditional journals that aren't traditionally open access, but have an open access option that you might have to pay for. I would just say, so the charges differ from journal to journal in both the amount and the type of fee that they have. You'll look into it and you'll find that out on the journal website, but you may be able to find waivers at a university if it's a prohibitive cost. Either for submitting to an open access journal or paying for open access at a non-traditional or at a traditional journal. I'm being told that my internet is unstable. Hopefully you guys are still with me. Another thing that you want to be aware of, so there's a short list here, or I guess a long list, but it doesn't include all of them. There are predatory journals that often promise quick turnaround on your manuscript, but offer low credibility, and they may actually some signs to look out for when you think you might have a predatory or might be working with a predatory journal. One of them is that they'll often send really spammy emails. And if you look into them, the quality of papers coming out of those journals are typically pretty low. Spelling and grammar. And they might often offer to skip or expedite peer review. But one thing that you really want to keep in mind is that you want to be publishing your work in journals that typically publish high quality science. So you really don't want to be selective. Jamil, do we have any questions? I think I saw some pop up.
Yeah, so we have one question. How many months can it take to publish an academic article? I think it will depend. I think it depends on the scientific journal, but I would like to know sort of like the general time span that it takes. And Andrea, you sort of covered this, but I mean, maybe you can speak a little bit more to the variance in the process.
Yeah, there's quite a bit of variance. So there are journals that kind of advertise a more expedited process. Really, it typically means that they're putting more pressure on reviewers to do that job quickly, but it can be, so I think that the average I gave you was also pretty variable. I said from 6 months to a year, but I've personally had something published in 4 months, and that was for a very quick, expedited sort of open access journal, and also something that took way longer, almost 2 years, and that was kind of held up because it was part of a broader supplement, so we were waiting on other authors for things. But it really can vary a lot, and a lot of that depends a bit on kind of the peer review process.
Yeah, if I may, Andrea, just add really quickly to that. Sometimes, so you were talking about the journal impact and prestige metrics.
Yeah.
Sometimes the way I think about it is, if you want to submit to a really high impact journal, if you want to sort of swing for the fences with a particular project, it can be a really good thing to do, but it also might add time to the overall process, right? Because the likelihood of getting accepted at a very top journal is just statistically lower than at other journals. And so basically you're committing to probably getting rejected at one journal and then starting over at another. So, I think it's not, there's not a right answer there, but it's worth considering that decisions about journals that you're going to send to are also decisions about how long it will probably take to get published.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I've heard people say that if you're never getting a paper rejected, that you're not shooting high enough. But I think it really is kind of a trade-off. So what matters more to you, sort of getting your paper out or getting in a higher impact journal? Yeah, those are great considerations. Do we have other questions?
Yeah, there's a question here. I hope I understand it correctly. Just, do you have references for editors, freelance or others? I don't know if that means sort of like whether they're independent folks who can work with someone on a manuscript. I hope I'm understanding that question correctly.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Oh, I think, is this referring to like language editing? I think that might be what it's for. I don't personally know of any, but that is a great question. And I think starting with some of these online resources, like Grammarly, for example, would be helpful. But I know that they definitely exist. So if you do a quick search, I'm sure you can find there are lots of freelance editors out there. But again, I would check with your university. I think the writing centers, a lot of them have sort of people in place to help out with that.
That's a great point, Andrea. Yeah, a lot of colleges and universities have writing centers where they'll basically do this sort of review of a manuscript for you. Another question that we're getting: this one's easy. Do you send to one journal at a time with each manuscript? The answer to that is yes.
Yeah.
One must submit. The strong convention is to submit journal articles in serial, not parallel to journals. So one at a time.
Yeah, thank you, Jamil. And that actually, I think I touch on that in the next slide. So I may just move on if we don't have other questions.
Yep.
Okay, great. So now I'm just going to touch on the main components of your manuscript submission, with the first being a cover letter. So you're going to be submitting a cover letter typically on university letterhead like this, and address, which should be available at your university. Or if not, you can have, if you're the corresponding author and you don't have letterhead, you could have the senior author also write the letter, use their letterhead. But it's typically addressed to the editor, and you're going to state whether or not this is a new or a revised submission, the type of manuscript. So for example, a research article or a review article. And you're going to make a statement that the manuscript is not under review anywhere else. So really journals, there ends up being kind of a bottleneck where a lot of people are submitting, only a small fraction are going to be able to be published. So they want to know they're not wasting their time and that you have submitted your work somewhere else. So that is really important. You also want to discuss the importance of the work and the fit for the journal, and just really sell up the novelty of the work. And then here in the cover letter, you can also suggest preferred or non-preferred reviewers. And some journals may also have a section to name those reviewers as well. And then there's going to be a title page, which will probably just be incorporated into the manuscript document itself. But this typically, the journal will have requirements for what should be on the title page, but it will likely include contact info for all of the authors, the authorship criteria, whether all of the authors met authorship criteria, and a financial disclosure or conflict of interest statement. Then you're going to have your manuscript document itself, which is typically in APA format. And then you're also going to want to be very diligent about checking the author instructions for specific journal guidelines. These will vary sometimes quite a bit from journal to journal, and the guidelines will detail the sections that they want, the word limits, et cetera. And then you'll also be uploading figures and supplementary material, sometimes separately, sometimes as part of the manuscript. So now I'm just going to shift into talking about what happens after submitting, and primarily about the peer review process. So once your manuscript gets in, the handling editor makes a decision. They typically select 2 to 3 scholars in your research area that will read and make a recommendation for or against publication of your manuscript. And provide any comments or suggestions for revision. They're typically given 3 to 4 weeks to complete the review, but sometimes this can get really drug out. There are lots of reasons why it might be delayed. So the editor may have trouble finding reviewers. I think, many times they have to go through multiple reviewers to get someone willing to review. The reviewers may request extensions. If reviewers disagree on a decision, the editor may invite a new reviewer just to get a more kind of holistic view of whether or not the manuscript is really appropriate for the journal. And so I think there's this kind of rule of thumb, like a 3-month rule. So if you haven't heard back from the journal and your paper has been under review for about 3 months, it's okay to follow up with the editor just to ask and make sure that it hasn't gotten stuck on the editor's desk or overlooked in some way. And then after that process, you'll get a notification of the editorial decision, which is the editor's decision based on reviewer recommendations. And you'll get that via a decision letter, which will include the decision, but also all of the feedback from each of the reviewers. So I'll briefly touch on the types of peer review. So single blind review is when authors' names are known to the reviewer, but reviewer names are not known to authors. Double blind is where neither authors nor reviewers know each other's names. This is sort of intended to reduce bias around giving more positive reviews, for example, to more prestigious or well-known or senior authors. And then there's something called an open review, where both authors and reviewers know each other's names. And many times, or in some cases at least, these are published with the manuscript, and the reviews are essentially signed. This is, I think there's kind of a trend in that direction toward increasing transparency, but there are pros and cons to all of them. I think one major one here is that it makes it a little bit more difficult for early career researchers to really say anything negative about the work of more senior authors. There are lots of discussions about that in the field. So I just want to talk quickly about participating in peer review. So I think peer review is a really valuable experience. So if you're serving as a reviewer yourself, but why would you do it? And I guess the first point is that it's a service to the field, typically unpaid. If you think about it, the fact that you're submitting your own papers, and each of your papers are going to be reviewed by 2 to 3 reviewers, and I think there's an average. I think each new submission is reviewed 3.5 times. Some people have suggested that we should have a goal of writing 3 to 4 reviews for every new submission or every new manuscript that we submit as a corresponding or sometimes senior author. And this is just to kind of pull our weight, essentially. There's still a discussion around whether journals should be profiting off of the free labor of scientists, but given that that's kind of the model and that others are reviewing our work, it's a service to the field to also review others' work. It's also a really nice opportunity to learn about the publication process. So if you haven't published yourself. This is a really nice way to kind of see the ins and outs of the process. And you also get to gain exposure to the latest research in your field and contribute to science as well. Hopefully the final product is actually improved as a result of your recommendations. So if you do get a request to review, if you're deciding whether or not you should do it, I guess a couple of things you should consider is whether or not you have the relevant expertise. And most likely you do if you're being invited to review, and whether you have the interest and the time. And also whether or not you have a conflict of interest. And in this case, it's typically whether or not if you were a student or an advisor of the author, that would be considered a conflict of interest, or if you've recently co-authored or are in the same department, or if you have a personal relationship, I think, or like a financial interest, those would be considered conflicts of interest and you might decline to review. But what if so typically you get asked to review after you've been publishing your own work, and that's how editors find you. But what if you want to learn about the process earlier? I feel like this is something that I was very naive about the publication process until I did it myself. And I really wish I had that valuable experience of peer reviewing beforehand to get more familiarity with it. And I think there are a couple ways of doing this if you're a bit proactive. So you can actually register to review with some journals. So they have kind of a list of reviewers that they turn to. So that's one way to do it if there's a journal that's really in your area and you would like to get some experience reviewing. You can also ask a colleague to recommend you when they decline. So often if you decline, you can recommend someone else to review on your behalf. Or if you're an advisor, sometimes you can have a student review on your in your place. I've also heard of some PIs that have their grad students, for example, co-write reviews with them. And that's a nice way of being able to get the experience, go through the process, but also to get sort of mentorship on doing that along the way, which I think is a really cool idea. And another thing I wanted to point out is that you can track your reviews. So there's this site called Publons where you can track the reviews that you've done and kind of metrics about them. And you just create a profile there. All right. So I'm not going to talk through the whole process of conducting a review, but I'm linking to a helpful guide here that kind of points at the bottom, that kind of points to the aspects of the research that you should consider and kind of how to do like a first read through and a second read through, for example. But typically the components of the review are, there's going to be a recommendation. So typically you're going to recommend accept, revise, or reject. And revise might be split into like minor revisions, major revisions, for example. You might be asked to give a rating of the quality of the research and the manuscript from like 1 to 100, for example. And then sort of the main like meat of the review is your written recommendations. So providing your comments, and you can kind of choose the way that you do this, but what you want to do is just really make sure that your recommendations are clear for the authors so that they can easily understand your points and respond. So typically you might structure it in kind of 3 main components: a summary of the work itself and the kind of overall contributions, any major issues that you've identified, and you might break that into subheadings based off of the sections of the manuscript, and then some minor issues, for example. And one thing that I think is really helpful here is just numbering your comments, which makes it easier for authors to respond. And typically, as a reviewer, you'll receive the decision letter from the editor with their final decision, and you can also read other reviewers' comments, which is also pretty cool and a nice way to learn about the process from other scientists. So next, I'm just going to talk a bit about responding to reviewer comments. So let's say that the decision on your article was to revise and resubmit. So what do you do at that point? So there are 2 main documents, in addition to another cover letter that you would have, but there are 2 main documents to the revise and resubmit. The first is going to be the revised manuscript, which will include any changes that you've made given the recommendations. So those, again, it could be anything. It could be figures, analyses, the writing itself, discussion of the like holes in the literature or pieces that you left out. Um, and the second piece will be a response letter. And so this is going to really document all of the changes that you've made to the manuscript. And we'll throw point by point response to each recommendation for revision. And you're going to state how you address the point in the manuscript or your rationale for your decision not to. So you don't have to do everything that reviewers suggest, but you need to show that you were responsive and that you've considered it, and that you have a reason that you didn't if you didn't make the change that they recommended. So this letter should be thoughtful and responsive to reviewers' concerns, and also courteous and appreciative. So I just consider the fact that reviewers may be spending a significant amount of time providing this feedback for you, and they're really doing it as a service. Just make sure that you're appreciative of that effort. And this document's really important, and it may actually, in some cases, end up being longer than the original manuscript, or about the same length. And also just keep in mind that it's going to be used to determine if the authors have made appropriate revisions to ensure that the manuscript is then fit for acceptance in that journal. I'll pause again just to see if there are any questions.
Yeah, Andrea, so we've got one question here. It's a very good one. That authors typically recommend reviewers, but as an undergraduate without many connections, who I'm not currently working with as co-authors, how do we recommend going about these recommendations? In other words, how do people figure out who to recommend as a reviewer if they might not feel like they've got that many personal connections or network connections to people who would?
Yeah, as a reviewer on your work itself. Actually, so the reviewers that you're recommending don't have to be personal connections at all. And typically they're people that you think have the expertise to evaluate your work. So it's likely and very often somebody that you've cited in the paper itself. So somebody who's done work that has sort of influenced the work that you're doing, or that you think can evaluate the work. So sometimes you might know the person, but I've recommended many reviewers that I don't personally know, and it's just somebody whose work has kind of influenced my work.
Yeah, I just want to co-sign that, Andrea. Yeah, the rule of thumb should be whoever you're citing a lot, whoever, basically, if you're building on other people's work, if their work is relevant to yours and yours to theirs, then that's a really great indication that they would make for good reviewers of it.
Yeah, and I think there's an argument for not recommending somebody that you have like a tight personal relationship with. That's not to say that you can't know anybody that you recommend as a reviewer, because obviously we end up kind of in small circles and you end up knowing people over time. But I think that you risk going into conflict of interest territory more on that side than the other.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I in fact not regularly, but sometimes do have to conflict myself out. And I think an editor can choose you as a reviewer, not knowing that you have a like close friendship, for instance, with someone on the paper. We're getting another question here. When is the appropriate stage in your career to start reviewing? That's a really good question.
That is a good question. Yeah, I sort of thought, I would love to hear your thoughts on this, Jamil. I always thought that sort of the editor would make that choice for me, and that if I wasn't getting an invitation, that I wasn't ready. But I don't think that's right. I think you have a lot more expertise in your area even before, and you're able to make a useful contribution even before you're like publishing regularly, for example.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think that reviewing serves a few different purposes. One, it goes on your CV, right? So it's a service that you can use to signal that you're sort of contributing to the field. I think probably more importantly, it helps you know how to write a paper that will get better reviews, right? I mean, I think that there's no better, or there are few better things for perspective taking. I mean, we're talking about reader-centric writing. Reviewing is becoming reader number one, right? It's an opportunity to think about what works and what doesn't work from the perspective of someone who's making decisions about a paper. So I think it's useful. I think one needs to feel as though they have the sufficient expertise to evaluate a paper. and I agree with you. It's hard to know internally, and sometimes external cues are helpful there. For me, it was my advisor who brought me in on a review uh, when I was in, I think, my second or third year of grad school, sort of like what you were saying, Andrea.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I think that editors or advisors can help make that decision. It's hard to sort of apply to be a reviewer, right? I mean, I think it's hard to know how. But that said, if you feel ready, I suppose one can always turn to their advisor and ask, are there papers that you think that I could get involved with?
Yeah, another thing that I've seen more recently is I know now is kind of a strange time where a lot of people are really struggling for extra time, but and so I think there have been a lot of reviewers declining reviews. So editors have been really struggling to find reviewers, and I've seen a few editors on Twitter actually ask if you feel like you're an appropriate or you have the appropriate expertise and you have the time to review. And you're an early career researcher, for example, like please sign up or please let me know, respond to this tweet or something like that. So
yeah, it's true. That's not common, but is happening now. Yeah, that's right.
more common now. Yeah.
Looks like we're
Anything
at
else?
the looks like we're at the 10-minute mark. Yeah, there's a question, but I can't see it, Andrea, because my Q&A box has gotten
Mm.
screwy. Is there any chance you can see it?
Yeah. Is it possible to ask to collaborate with other professionals as an undergraduate that can offer some skills, but is ultimately new to the process?
So is this the review process?
Yeah, I'm not sure if this is referring to the review process or like the research process, but I would imagine maybe the review process.
So if it's the research process, the answer is absolutely yes. I mean, we hear from people all the time who are wanting to get involved with our work, and that's a totally welcome thing. It's not always the case that every lab has space, but it's a very normative thing to reach out to labs and offer help and collaboration. For the review process, it might be a little bit trickier because reviews are they are confidential, right? So it's for instance, if I was reviewing a paper, I wouldn't be comfortable necessarily like sharing it even with my lab, and I certainly wouldn't share it with a class that I was, right? I mean, it's still in the peer review process. So I think it might be a little bit tricky to sort of enter that process oneself. But that said, as we were saying, you can always ask, I think probably more like during grad school, if I'm honest, but sort of ask your advisor or other folks who are senior, whether they think that you're ready for the review process. And if so, to consider sending you review invitations that they've received.
Yeah, that sounds good. Cool. Okay, I just have I think about 3 more slides, so maybe I'll push forward with those, and then we can take some questions at the end. Does that work? Okay. All right. So the next thing I'm going to talk about is preprints. So there's kind of a new option for making your research publicly available and doing so more quickly, and that's to publish a preprint of the article. And this precedes peer review typically. So you might post your work like a final-ish or submittable version of your manuscript to a preprint server, which I've listed some below, like archive, bioarchive, SciArchive, for example. And the nice thing about preprints is that they promote early and open access to science and can be cited, and you can list them on your CV. It also increases transparency about the editorial process. So sometimes you can see the preprint version and then the final version of a manuscript, for example, and you can really see where peer review has kind of changed and hopefully improved the manuscript, which is kind of cool. Another thing about preprints is that authors retain the copyright to their work. So typically, whenever you publish an article with a journal, you're transferring the copyright to the journal or the publisher when you publish your research. And as a result, because depending on the open access policy, you might be prohibited from actually posting the final version of your own article online. But this kind of provides a workaround. If you publish a preprint, that's open and there's open access, and you can have that version kind of publicly available to your peers or to the public, but also go through the peer review process and the publication process. Um, yeah, so after publishing, well, first of all, congrats. But the next step is really to think about promoting your work to ensure that it's seen by other scientists and the public, which is sometimes hard for people to do. But I think it's really important. So most of us are probably not doing science just because like purely for the enjoyment, but maybe because of the potential for impact. But really to have that impact, it necessitates a bit of sort of tasteful promotion of your work. I'm just going to highlight a couple of accessible ways of doing that. So one is to contact your university's press promotion team, which might be called something like the Public Information or Communications Office. And you can just let them know about your upcoming publication, and you might provide them with a copy, the latest copy, and a brief summary. And so press typically gets news report ahead of publication while the paper is still under embargo. So if the press is interested, they might try to cover and interview you on your work ahead of publication. What that means is that really you should be contacting your university's press team before the paper ever comes out. And at that point, it's kind of oftentimes considered old news. So the press really wants to get a hold of it when it's really new. Another thing you can do is you can do science communication through media like Twitter. So there have been there's been like an increase in using tweet threads to briefly summarize or digest work for readers, which I think is really helpful. It's really helpful to see someone else's tweet thread, but you can also do that to promote your own work. It's just kind of nice to maybe lurk on Twitter a little bit and see how it's done, so that it's done kind of tastefully. But another thing that I would highly recommend is making sure that you're increasing your visibility and also finding other scholars by creating accounts like a Google Scholar account. I think that's really important. It basically collates you can see Einstein's work here. It collects all of the works that you have published and also their citations, and then you can see the work that is cited your work. So it's really nice you track your citations, for example. So it really makes sure that that you're sort of visible to your community. And another thing that you can do is create an OrchID or Orchid ID account, which provides a unique identifier for you as an academic. And this actually tracks your publications and other scholarly outputs. So that might include like dissertations or grants that you've gotten as well. And then also it's just helpful to follow other scholars on these things too, so you can see when their new work comes out. So the last thing I'm going to touch on is just listing your papers on your CV. So what do you do? Many times you're applying to grad school or to jobs while your manuscript is in that sort of long publication cycle. So how do you list them so that you can make sure that you're showcasing your work, but you don't have to wait until it's fully in print before you get to show that or kind of claim it on your CV? So I'm going to just provide some guidelines here for how to label them. So if it's already published, that's great. You can just add the date that it's published. So student A, supervisor B, 2020, for example. If your manuscript has been accepted at a journal, you can list it as in press, or sometimes I've seen forthcoming or accepted, for example. And in this case, you can name the journal that where it's in press, because the decision's been made, it's coming out. If the manuscript is undergoing peer review, you can list it as under review or submitted, just to show that kind of how far you are along that process. But in this case, don't name the journal because you don't know that it's necessarily coming out in that journal. And then likewise, if you have a working draft of a paper, you can list it as in prep. And I've seen some back and forth about whether or not you should be listing papers as in prep, because what does that really mean? So my suggestion is just once you have a working draft, you can list it as in prep. And in that case, especially, do not list the name of a journal, because you may have sort of goal journals where you're planning to submit, but that definitely doesn't mean that it's going to be accepted or published there. And importantly, you can list preprints. So sometimes rather than having an in-prep working draft, it might look better to just show the preprint on your CV, because then whoever is looking over your CV can actually access and read the work that you've done. But if you're doing that, you'll want to list it along with the DOI or the digital object identifier, and just make sure that you're not identifying it as peer reviewed. So if you have, a separate section on your CV for peer reviewed, articles, you would not list your preprint there, for example. But if you're early career and you don't have, a ton of publications to put on your CV, that's totally fine. And these rules kind of change as you become more senior. So you might consider including a separate working projects or in progress section for additional unpublished projects so that you can show what you've been working on, what you're hoping to write up, and you don't have to be limited to just listing your manuscripts, for example. So that's all the material I have. Do we want to see if there are any remaining questions? I think we're right at time, so I don't know.
Great, Andrea, thank you. Yeah, I think we are pretty much at time. Thank you so much. So that was really great. And obviously you fielded a lot of questions throughout. So hopefully this has been helpful to folks. And yeah, I mean, just wanted to say thanks to everyone for joining us. This is a lot of fun. And yeah, again, we hope that this series in general is useful to you, and we'll be back next week. Great, so until then, take care everyone and enjoy the long weekend.
Bye, thanks guys.